Welcome to another Awakening Series number 9. Today we will be discussing part 4 of the Paṭiccasamuppāda. And this is a continuation from the past few series. So what I'd like to do now, share with you this link. With this link, you can download the PowerPoint slides to follow along when it is ready. Okay. Let's take a quick look at what we have covered so far. This is the 9th in the series. The first 3 we dealt with is on the process of perception, Paṭiccasamuppāda Kanda, part 1. So it's Awakening series, 1, 2, 3, and Paṭiccasamuppāda, part 1, part 2, part 3. Then we talked about the awakening of the Bodhisattva, part 1, part 2. And then we covered the first 3 parts of Paṭiccasamuppāda. And I have put in there now in blue the links. When you download the slides, you will be able to click on that link and you can go straight to the video. So when you download this slides this time, you can click on the link and go straight to the video and watch the actual video of the sharing that occurred at that time on YouTube. It is uploaded on YouTube. Okay, so moving on. Now we spoke about the how the Bodhisattva awakened, and then upon how the Bodhisattva developed his meditation and attained the highest, most supreme state of stopping the mind in sentience, and that process is called Sanya Vedayita Nirodha. And then awoke from that and saw the Paṭiccasamuppāda unfolding. So we have already covered the whole process in those first 3 parts. Today, I'm going to deal with a few very important parts, a few very important aspects, and answer some of the questions. So I hope you will be able to appreciate this even further based on the lessons by Bhante Punnaji. Okay. First, I'd like to point out that when the mind comes to a stop, that process that leads the mind to stopping is called the Sanya Vedayita Nirodha. Now, a lot of people have confused themselves with the other term, Nirodha Samapatti. And if you read a lot of the literature, just about all of them said that Nirodha Samapatti is the same as Sanya Vedayita Nirodha, meaning that Nirodha Samapatti means the mind had stopped. That is not correct. According to Bhante Punnaji, he had explained very clearly the meaning of Nirodha Samapatti. What it really means, Nirodha Samapatti is describing an enlightened person's mind where he has freed himself from existence. So the concept of existence no longer exists in the mind of the Arahant. That means the Arahant had become awakened from the dream of existence. And then when the Arahant is conscious, and this is when the Arahant is conscious, that state is called Nirodha Samapatti. So that is the conscious mind of an awakened person. That's what Nirodha Samapatti meant. The mind of the conscious mind of an awakened person. Sanya Vedayita Nirodha is the process by which the mind is brought to a stop, where you have completely stopped all sensations and feelings. So cessation of all sensations and feeling. So there's no consciousness. So there's a big difference. Now let's take a look at what Bhante explained. I just have a question regarding these 2 terms, Sanya Vedayita Nirodha and Nirodha Samapatti. These are 2 terms. Are they both describing exactly the same thing, or is there any difference between these 2 conditions?
Well, what is the difference between closing the eyes and not seeing. Now when you close your eyes, do you see anything? You don't see anything unless it is just imagination. But the Sanya Vedaita Nirodha is like closing the eyes. And what is that other word?
Nirodha Samapatti.
Yeah, Nirodha Samapatti. Of course, Nirodha Samapatti is a different thing. Don't think that Nirodha Samapatti is the same thing as Sanya Vedaita Nirodha. Today, most people think Nirodha Samapatti and Sanya Vedaita Nirodha is the same thing. No. When you come out of that and awaken, you begin to see how the mind is working and creating this. Seeing that is Nirodha Samapatti. So, the Nirodha Samapatti, during Nirodha Samapatti, you are fully aware of what is going on. Yeah.
So then, that means, from your interpretation, these two terms do not really mean exactly the same thing.
No.
As Bhante pointed out, they do not mean exactly the same thing. Now, here, Bhante actually explained this with the fact that Nirodha Samapatti, the mind is still conscious. So in other words, it's the conscious mind of an enlightened being. And Bhante pointed out two sutras where Venerable Ananda first asked the Buddha the question about the mind of an enlightened being, whether that person can still perceive his environment. So percipient, as he said. And after asking the Buddha that question, Venerable Ananda then went to see Venerable Sariputta, and Sariputta at that time was already enlightened, and asked Sariputta exactly the same question. So these are the two sutras where the first one, Ananda asked the Buddha about the state of Nirodha Samapatti, and then went to see Sariputta in the next sutra, Anguttara Nikaya 10.6 and 10.7, asked Sariputta the same question.
Now some people who write books on Buddhism, they also think the Nirodha Samapatti is the stopping of the mind. Huh?
That's right. They say it's the same as the Sanya Vedayita Nirodha.
Yeah.
Basically, almost all the references I come across regarding these two terms, they say they are the same.
Now, I have brought here a sutra which we have to make paid homage to him, sat down at one side and said to him, Bhante, could the bhikkhu obtain such a state of concentration? Now concentration there means samadhi. Yeah?
Samadhi, yes.
Yeah. He would not be percipient of earth in relation to earth, water in relation to water, fire in relation to fire, air in relation to air, of the base of infinity of space in relation to the infinity of space. That is the samadhi, yeah?
Yes.
And the infinity of consciousness, the infinity of nothingness, and the infinity of neither perception nor non-perception of this world in relation to this world, relation to the other world in relation, but he could still be percipient.
What does percipient mean, Bhante?
Still conscious.
Still conscious, able to perceive.
Able to perceive. Then the Buddha said, the important thing is to be free of all those experiences, but at the same time you're conscious. And so the Buddha says, he could Ananda, but how, Bhante, could he obtain such a state of consciousness? Here Ananda, Bhikkhu is percipient. This is peaceful, this is sublime.
I'm sorry.
That is what is called the Nirodha Samapatti. So that Nirodha Samapatti, this is just to show that Nirodha Samapatti is not the cessation of sensation and perception.
Okay, here. So this sutra is explaining the state of Nirodha Samapatti.
Yeah. That is to point out that Nirodha Samapatti is a state where you are fully
Still
conscious.
Percipient.
Percipient.
That's right. So it's strange that everybody else seems to be talking about Nirodha Samapatti as a state where you have no sensation and anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I especially chose this sutra to point out that.
Yeah, that is very helpful, Bhante.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the next sutra, this Ananda,
he said
he goes to Sariputta and asks the same question.
Here.
And he answers the same way.
And he gets the same answer.
Yeah.
So this Venerable Ananda is a little bit naughty, asking Buddha one question, getting the answer, and then he went to see Venerable Sariputta and asked exactly the same question. Either he was testing Venerable Sariputta or he was not very sure and wanted to clarify or whatever it was. So that's what happened. So now Bhante wants to explain more clearly about this awakening from the dream of existence, the state of mind of an arahant called the Nirodha Samapatti. Okay. Perhaps Bhante could then explain the translation of the word Nirodha Samapatti then. What exactly is Samapatti?
I told you, Nirodha Samapatti means Nirodha. First you have to understand the word Samapatti.
Yeah.
The Samapatti means attainment. Samapatti. Anatipata Veramani Sikkhapadam Samadhiyami. What is Samadhiyami? That means you have entered that state of avoiding harming living beings. So that samadhiyami is a action, a verb, and samadhiyami means something has been done. So Nirodha Samapatti means you have attained that state. So Nirodha means the stopping. It is really what we call awakening from the dream of existence. Nirodha means the stopping. What is stopped is bhava. Bhava nirodho nibbana. Bhava nirodho nibbana. What we call nibbana or nirvana is the stopping of bhava. And bhava means existence. So you don't exist anymore. So Nirodha Samapatti means you have entered the stopping of existence. That means you don't exist anymore. You have awakened from the dream of existence. That awakening is like you have been dreaming. It's a dream. When you wake up, that dream is no more a truth. But while you are dreaming, it is real for you. But when you wake up, the dream is not real anymore. So in the same way, normally people think, I am existing. But when you awaken from this dream, you are aware that you are not existing anymore. That awakening is the Nirodha Samapatti. That awakening from the dream is what is called Nirodha Samapatti.
So that means when a person has reached that state, he now has become the Buddha.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have become a Buddha.
Yeah. Nirodha Samapatti is a person who has completely eliminated the thought of existence. He has awakened from the dream of existence. So when the Bodhisattva Siddhartha meditated until the mind had stopped, and therefore he used that process called the Sanya Vedayita Nirodha, and he reached the stopping of the mind, that is the state of insentience. So as he woke from there, the mind began to construct. So that construction, sankhara, started. And with that, the mind awoke. And from that point onwards, the Buddha's mind was in a state of Nirodha Samapatti. And basically for the rest of his living life, as long as the body was still alive, the mind would be in a state of Nirodha Samapatti. That is the state of mind of an enlightened being. Still percipient, but no longer thinking of existence in any way. The mind has completely eliminated all existence. So with that consciousness, the mind begins to perceive environment. Now here, in describing the Paṭiccasamuppāda, the Bhante Punnaji was actually explaining it that the Buddha saw how a normal person's mind would be working. So in other words, as we go through this process, we're not talking about the mind of an arahant. We're talking about how the mind of a normal, non-enlightened person began to create and perceive the environment and create the world. So with that sankhara, it began to construct. Now, I want to point out an important thing, and this is another thing I want to clarify. A lot of people translate this Paṭiccasamuppāda and explain it with the three-life model. So what they did is that they said that from the previous life, the person was reborn in the present life. And then that person had consciousness. And that's why they translate the word vijnana to consciousness. But actually, that is not correct. Vijnana is not really talking about consciousness of of everything. It's basically talking about perception through the five senses, only through the sixth sense, the mind, that we have consciousness. This is not talking about a person who had now been born into the next life. This is not the three-life model. But people who translate this into the three-life model would then explain here the sankhara is the construction of volition and volitional karma. In other words, there are people who say in the Paṭiccasamuppāda, the sankhara is volitional construction. That means construction of karma. But Bhante Punnaji pointed out that it's not correct. This sankhara is really the mental construction, because the mind had just woken up, and that mental construction, that the person who had just awoken from it would be able to be conscious. And therefore, this sankhara is talking about mental construction of consciousness, not volitional construction of karma. So let's listen to Bhante Punnaji's explanation that this sankhara is not the mental construction of, this sankhara is mental construction and not volitional construction of karma. Because people who try to explain it with a three-life model will then explain sankhara here is the volitional construction of karma.
You described very clearly just now that we are seeing colors.
Yeah.
And then the mind constructs these colors into pictures, images, called rupa. Now, this process of construction of the image in the mind, that is called sankhara.
That's right.
Yeah. This is what you translate as mental construction.
Yeah.
Here it is constructing raw sensations, sanya, and feelings, vedana, and forming into a image in the mind.
Yeah.
Now, many people have translated sankhara to also refer to some kind of construction of volition and karma. So can you clarify, Bhante, sankhara, does it have anything to do with construction of volition? You know?
Well, this is a problem here, because people have never understood it in this way. So if people don't understand it in this way, they will give different translations for these words, you say. So the sankhara has nothing to do with volition. First we have to understand the meaning of volition. Volition is what is called will, or the will powers, or will. Volition, that is the meaning of volition. Chetana, yeah. And so, this has nothing to do with that, but there is a problem. So if I get into that, talking about that, you might get confused. That is why I didn't want to get into that. Because if you read the books on the Paṭiccasamuppāda, the traditional explanation is a wrong explanation. Because according to the tradition, now we have avidya paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijñānam. So we have these words, avidya, sankhara and vijñāna. The traditional people, they have never understood what I just said. So instead of doing that, they say, avidya is the ignorance of what is good and bad, not knowing what is good and bad, not knowing what is right and wrong. That is the avidya. That is how they explain it. Because we don't know what is good and bad, right and wrong, we do the wrong things. And that is what is called karma. Karma. The word karma or kamma in Pali, karma in Sanskrit. Now they say avidya paccaya sankhara means through the ignorance of what is good and bad, right and wrong, we do bad karma. And because we do bad karma, we are reborn in the next life according to the karma. And that is what is called vijnana. Vijnana, the word vijnana, they say is rebirth. So this, you see, they are now talking about karma and rebirth. Now this is why I call that karma and rebirth Buddhism. That is a different kind of Buddhism. You see, this karma and rebirth Buddhism was there even before the Buddha. Buddha didn't come into the world to talk about karma and rebirth. That's the first thing to understand. Because that was already there. People knew about it. Buddha came into the world to talk about a different thing. That was what is called the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths is not talking about karma and rebirth. That's the important thing to understand. Four Noble Truths is about what we call suffering, what is the cause of suffering, what is the end of suffering, and what is the way leading to the end of suffering. That is what the Buddha is talking about. Not karma and rebirth.
So people who talk about karma and rebirth Buddhism, they then use the three life model to explain the Paṭiccasamuppāda. So at this point, this sankhara here, they describe it as the volitional construction of the karma. But it is just simply mental construction of being able to perceive the environment. So that is the beginning of the cognitive process. We already spoke about that. And then you are aware of objects and identify them, nama rupa. And then you have the six senses and they work together. And then they give you a complete picture of the environment. Then you have the concept of the world out there, phassa. And this basically completes the creation of the concept of the object we call world. So the objective experience is created in the cognitive process. And then we begin to feel something about the world, whether the feeling is pleasant or unpleasant. And with that, we have feeling of the environment. And that is the start of the affective process, the chitta. And from there, it leads on to reaction. So when we feel something, whether we like it or we don't like it, we will react in some ways. And there are three kinds of reaction. Something pleasant, we then react to the sensual pleasures with desire and lust and greed. That's kama tanha. And then if it is unpleasant, we react with aversion and anger and hatred. That's vibhava tanha. And at the same time, we call this reaction mind. So this is the subjective experience. And with that subjective experience, we begin to personalize the subjective experience and say, this is my experience. This is my reaction. So this is personalizing the subjective experience. And with that, we begin to think of existence. Because then we need to find something that represents this self that I call I, me, or mine. Right? And there are three types of these reactions, lobha, dosa, moha. And then when we begin to personalize the reaction, we begin to create the concept of existence. So coming into existence, this imaginary self and in an imaginary world. And then this is really the emotional mind working, the chitta, the affective process. And of course, with that, we personalize the body. So let's take a look at how the body is being personalized. And this process of personalizing the body as me, Because when you begin to feel you are reacting, you say, oh, this is my reaction. Then what is me? What is I? There must be an I. And therefore, you begin to think of the body, because the body seems to occupy space. So when you begin to personalize your subjective experience, you begin to create this imaginary self of I, me, or mine. It's my experience. With that subjective experience, and there must be a self. And then who is that self? What is that self? So you begin to think of them. It must exist. And the most convenient thing that you can happen to be aware of is there is this body, because the body occupies space and time. So therefore, you want to look for stability of this self, and seeking the stability of the self, then you must think, you think the self must exist in this objective world. And therefore, the body conveniently became the representation or manifestation of the concept of self. And then that's when you begin to personalize the body as the self. So you conceiving that the body is the subjective self that exists in an objective world. And this whole process is called Sakkaya Ditthi. And this is actually the first fetter we must eliminate. That's why the Buddha said there are 10 fetters to be eliminated to become an arahant. And this is the first fetter to be eliminated. And that is to give up the idea that this body is the self. Right? The body is nothing but the mechanics to experience the environment. Right? It's not the self. It's not an enduring self. Now, I'm going to show you an experiment why it is so easy for us to personalize the body as the self. So I'm going to show you an experiment of this person here going through an experiment where you can see the right hand of that lady is not the real right hand. The right hand of the lady is hidden behind the board. What you see there is a fake hand. So this is called the fake hand experiment. That this lady ends up personalizing this fake hand as her hand. So if people can personalize the fake hand as their own real hand, imagine what they can do to the body. So let's take a look at this experiment by the neuroscientists, explaining how easy it is for us to personalize the fake hand. In this experiment, how easy it is to personalize the fake hand as though it is our real hand.
Jonah's recreating a classic psychology experiment.
The rubber hand illusion is a funny hack of the brain where you can convince people very quickly that this rubber arm is actually their own arm.
He's setting up a stand at Venice Beach, where he'll test volunteers to see if they can experience sensations in a hand that's not theirs.
Welcome to the rubber hand experience. I want you to put your left hand right here and put your right hand right here.
Jonah has participants hide their right hand out of sight behind a divider.
Just gonna drape this so as if it's your real hand.
While he places a rubber hand on the table in front of them.
Just stare at this hand.
Jonah primes participants by brushing both the fake and real hand simultaneously, a process which helps the brain link the feeling to the fake arm.
I feel like you're doing that to my hand, but that's not my hand. My hand's over there, so that's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird.
Now that Jonah has linked this volunteer's brain to the new hand, he's got an even bigger surprise for her.
I was a little bit scared.
Good flinch.
Oh my goodness. When you hit that thing, I thought I was gonna lose my hand. So that was so scary. And it really felt like that was like I could move those fingers if I wanted to. My brain decided that it was that I could feel that, and that you hitting that was hitting me. That's so strange how it does that.
Impressive, right? Let's see how many other people fall prey to this mind game.
My name's Jonah. Okay, so you keep on staring at that hand.
That was crazy. That was crazy.
Okay.
Oh wow, that scared me.
That scared you?
although around 10% of the participants weren't able to mentally connect the fake hand to their body.
Did it feel like I smashed your hand at all? No.
No.
Most felt some kind of phantom sensation, if not actual pain. Jonah is hacking into these people's mental body maps,
Oh my God.
causing them to connect information inaccurately.
Right.
All right, so what you saw there is that the lady's right hand was hidden behind a shield. And here on this left side, you can see that is the lady's hand. And on the right side, that is a fake hand. So the scientist was brushing on both hands at the same time, but the lady was not able to see that her real hand was being brushed. The lady saw that the fake hand was being brushed. But since the scientist brushed both hands at the same time, the lady felt that there was brushing of the hand. There was this pleasant sensation of brushing of the hand while she saw the fake hand was being brushed. And because she saw the fake hand was being brushed, she associated somehow this fake hand that was being brushed, and she could feel the sensation. Oh, you know, the mind automatically, unknowingly associated the fake hand as though it's the real hand. So I'll show you the actual explanation here.
Jonah primes participants by brushing both the fake and real hand simultaneously, a process which helps the brain link the feeling to the fake arm.
I feel like you're doing that to my hand, but that's not my hand. My hand's over there. So that's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird.
What happened there is the lady felt the sensation of brushing on the hand because the scientist was brushing both the real hand and the fake hand at the same time. So that's sanya, sensation. And then that sensation was pleasant. The feeling had a pleasant feeling. That sensation had a pleasant feeling. That is Vedana. So when so there was feeling the sensation, Vedana, but seeing the fake hand being brushed, what the lady did was associated how she felt. So how she felt with what she saw. And this is really combining more than one sense. So it's combining the sense of seeing with the sense of touch. So we actually make use of all our senses, and that is making use of the salayatana. And then because of that, she started to personalize, upadana, personalize the fake hand as her real hand. Based on this subjective experience of feeling the brushing, while at the same time associating that feeling with seeing the fake hand being brushed. So you can see if that can happen to a person under normal circumstances, imagine what happens to us. Our senses are picking up touches and feelings and hearing sounds and seeing objects and smelling odors and tasting flavors. So all that makes us associate that with the feeling, and therefore we think of this body is me. This is really how we begin to personalize the body as the self, and that is the process of Sakkaya Ditthi. Okay. Now I'm going to show you an explanation of a very famous neuroscientist, psychologist and psychiatrist by the name of Antonio Damasio, who at that time was based at University of Southern California, where he gave a TED talk explaining about how the notion of self came into our mind. In other words, how the mind became to think of we have a self, right?
What is consciousness? What is a conscious mind? Well, first of all, it is a mind which is a flow of mental images. And of course, consider images that can be sensory patterns, visual, such as you're having right now in relation to the stage and me, or auditory images as you're having now in relation to to my words. That flow of mental images is mind. But there is something else that we're all experiencing in this room. We are not passive exhibitors of visual or auditory or tactile images. We have selves. We have a me that is automatically present in our minds right now. We own our minds, and we have a sense that it's every one of us that is experiencing this, not the person who is sitting next to you. So in order to have a conscious mind, you have a self within the conscious mind. So a conscious mind is a mind with a self in it. The self introduces a subjective perspective in the mind, and we are only fully conscious when self comes to mind. So what we need to know to even address this mystery is, number one, how minds are put together in the brain, and number two, how selves are constructed. But what about the self? The self is really the elusive problem. And for a long time, people did not even want to touch it, and because they say, how can you have this sort of reference point, this stability that is required to maintain the continuity of selves day after day? And I thought about a solution to this problem is the following. We generate brain maps of the body's interior and use them as the reference for all other maps. So let me tell you just a little bit about how I came to this. I came to this because if you're going to have a reference that we know as self, the me, the I in our own processing, we need to have something that is stable, something that does not deviate much from day to day. Well, it so happens that we have a singular body. We have one body, not two, not three, and so that is a beginning. There is just one reference point, which is the body.
When self comes to mind. So he said, now I also want to point out a very important thing that it is common amongst all psychologists and neuroscientists, right, and neurologists. When they use the word consciousness, it doesn't just mean being awake or being aware. It means the awareness of a self in the world. That's really what they meant. So consciousness is not just being aware. Here, consciousness is being aware of a self existing in a world. That is the way a lot of psychologists, neuroscientists, and neurologists define the word consciousness. Right? So scientists use the word consciousness to mean being aware of a self in the world. So basically here, Antonio Damasio was describing that in the case of a conscious mind, it is a mind which has a continuous flow of mental images. So this continuous flow of mental images is exactly what the Buddha described as Paṭiccasamuppāda arising all the time. We are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So these mental images arise in the form of rupa in the mind, right? Mental image in the mind. That is the rupa, right? Being aware of being aware of this continuous flow of mental images arising in the mind. And basically, as I pointed out, scientists always say a conscious mind is a mind with a self in it. They didn't say a self exists. They just say it is a mind that has the concept of a self in it. And the self introduces this subjective perspective in the mind. This is basically exactly what the Buddha was describing in Paṭiccasamuppāda. And then he says, we are fully conscious when self comes to mind. And there you have it. The scientist has stated it very clearly. They use the word consciousness to mean being aware of a self. So they say then a person is fully conscious when the notion of a self arises in the mind. That the mind now think of the existence of a self. This is also the reason why a lot of scientists reject the idea that animals are conscious in that sense. Some of them just say animals do not have the same consciousness as the human being. Now, perhaps animals may or may not have the same level of intelligence, but certainly some animals, those with well-developed cerebral cortex, like the dolphins, the chimpanzees, right? And to some degree, some mammals, they have the notion of a self. right? They are aware of themselves in the environment. They may not have the same intelligence to deal with the environment like a human being does, but in reality, animals do have this sense of consciousness. But that's why here in the case of the scientists, they point out to full consciousness means a self comes to mind, and many of them say animals are not conscious. So this is the reason why a lot of scientists say animals are not conscious beings, right? Not all scientists say that, but some scientists say that. And that is the reason, because they say that animals don't have a sense of self. But I think my own personal opinion is that if you can see some animals, they behave as though they are aware of themselves, you know. Okay, moving on, it says, he pointed out that we need to know how minds are put together in the brain. That means how mind are working, right? So in other words, the activity of the brain gives rise to the consciousness and gives rise to mind working. So really, mind is the activity of the body. So that's really answering the first question. And the second one, how selves are constructed. That we have already described that in the earlier experiment, the fake hand experiment, where we begin to associate what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch with that it is this body that is experiencing it, therefore this body is me, right? And this is how selves are constructed, because of the experience of the body. And Antonio Damasio went on to say that we generate brain maps of the body's interior and use them as a reference point for all other maps of the world. So I'll come back to explain this in a moment. But basically, in a nutshell, inside our brain, right, we are aware of various parts of the body. Even if you close your eyes, you know where your nose is. You know where your ears are, right? You know which is your left hand, which is your right hand, even without looking. So in the brain, we have a map of every part of the body. Right? You basically can touch any part of the external part of your body that you can reach without looking. Right? If you can do it while looking, you can also do it without looking, because inside your brain you have a map of every part of your body, and then we use this as a reference to guide us how we react to the environment. This is what he meant by use them as a reference point for all other maps of the world. So we use our awareness of different parts of the body to guide us how we respond to the world. Therefore, the body becomes the reference point for the self. And this is the most important point that is made here. The body becomes the reference point for the self. So in other words, this is a notion, a concept that is created in the mind, and that this body is the reference point for the self, right? So this is really what the Antonio Damasio was saying. He's a very well-known neuroscientist who has done a lot of scientific research on, especially on emotions. Okay, he mentioned we generate brain maps of the body's interior and uses them as a reference point for all other maps of the world. So in other words, comparing this with the teachings of the Buddha, this is really the process of perception, the Paṭiccasamuppāda. Paṭiccasamuppāda basically creates this objective experience because, with all our senses, we are able to perceive through our senses, and we begin to create this objective experience that we're experiencing in the environment. And then and how we feel about it becomes a subjective experience. Right? I feel, I like it, I don't like it, the I comes first. So the subjective experience of the self arises. That's why he concluded that the body becomes the reference point for the self. Because when we begin to feel the environment, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, we personalize this subjective experience with the notion there is a self in the world. and the body conveniently represents the self, right? So this is another perspective of scientists explaining about how we actually personalize the body, how we use the body as a reference point for the to respond to the world. So this is really the scientist explanation of Sakkaya Ditthi, exactly the same thing, that the mind creates the notion that the body becomes the reference point for the self. Right? So I hope that is very clear. I hope the notion of Sakkaya Ditthi is properly explained, that our mind creates the notion that the self, there is a self, and then the mind begins to personalize this experience we call the self and associate it with the body and say, oh, the body is the self, right? So if we want to become enlightened, the first state of attainment is to become a Sotapan. And the first thing you have to do is abandon the notion that the body is the self, the Sakkaya Ditthi. So we have to give up that notion of Sakkaya Ditthi. So with all these arising, we begin to think of existence. Then because we think of existence, then we get reborn. So take a look at the sequence. At the bottom, Vedana, when we feel the environment, that becomes our subjective experience. Then Tanha, we begin to react to the environment. So then we call that my reaction. And with the word my, we begin to create the concept of a self. Upadana, we begin to personalize this and say, oh, I like it, I don't like it. So then we begin to think I exist, and the body occupies space and time, so the body exists. And that is when we get born over and over again. So we get reborn, and then we age and we die. And basically, this is the insecurity of life, dukkha, and that along with that comes the whole mass of suffering of soka, parideva, dukkha, domanassa, and upayasa. Okay, so this is really what Paṭiccasamuppāda is talking about, that the mind creates all these concepts. And the Buddha, when he woke up from the insentience, state of insentience, he saw it unfolding. Okay, I already noticed there are a couple of questions. I will come back to the questions at the end of the presentation. Let's move on. There's a couple more things I want to show before we finish off to go into the questions. Right now, this part here, the affective process, is really our emotional subjective experience. The subjective experience is part of the chitta, the affective process. This is the emotional experience. Subjective experience is always emotional because it is feeling it is pleasant, we like it. Feeling it is unpleasant, we don't like it. While at the same time, we have the delusion of a self-centered existence. So now let's let Bhante explain in a more complete view of really what Paṭiccasamuppāda is trying to explain, teach us.
That Paṭiccasamuppāda, if properly understood, all suffering can be brought to an end. That's what the Buddha pointed out. And how is that? He pointed out that although the existential philosophers thought that we exist, that existence is the most fundamental thing, the Buddha pointed out that existence is a delusion. That's the wrong concept. we do not really exist. Now that he understood by freeing the mind of emotions. It is the emotions that make us think that we exist. The emotions are not able to think, and the emotions desire things or hate things. It is only by getting rid of emotions and purifying the mind, freeing the mind of emotions, that the idea of existence will disappear. So he purified the mind, and that is how we talk about the Jhanas. We said the Jhanas are really levels of mental purity.
So the jhanas are levels of mental purity. Right? So what Bhante explained is that Paṭiccasamuppāda, if properly understood, all suffering can be brought to an end. That means if you truly, properly comprehend what Paṭiccasamuppāda is teaching you, then it is possible for you to free yourself from suffering and become enlightened. Right? And because existence is a delusion, we do not really exist. We're living in a dream of existence. Right? And he pointed out that it's the Buddha who understood this by freeing the mind of emotions. Emotions make us think we exist, right? And emotions are not able to think. It makes us think we exist. Emotions by themselves are not able to think. Emotions just desire things or hate things or begin to focus on a self-centered existence. And this is why we think we exist. It is the emotions that's driving us to focus our mind on the notion of a self-centered existence. So it is only by getting rid of emotions and purifying the mind that this idea of existence will disappear. And this is really the important thing about Paṭiccasamuppāda is telling us how the mind created the notion the world exists, the objective experience, and then we react to it, the subjective experience. We personalize this experience, upadana, and then we begin to create the notion of existence. Right? Now, this is a very important point I want to show you now. A lot of us, if I were to ask you this question, why do you exist, right? Then people will always think, oh, I exist because I was born. So in other words, you think you're born and that is why you exist. Look at this video and then I'll come back to talk about it.
We have been born. We are born, we grow old, fall sick and die. And what is the cause of birth? Why are we born? Now the important thing is that we think we have come into existence. And how did we come into existence? Because we were born. But here the Buddha is pointing out we didn't come into existence because we were born. This is an interesting thing. We were born because we have come into existence. Normally people think that we have come into existence because we were born. Here the Buddha points out that we were born because we have come into existence. Bhava-pacca jati. Not jati-pacca bhava. This is the interesting thing. Then the problem comes up, how did we come into existence? This is the interesting thing. How did we come into existence? There the Buddha points out, upadana pacca bhava. Upadana means personalizing. Upadana means to take inside. By personalizing, we have come into existence.
Bhante pointed out that it is by personalizing that we have come into existence. So the cognitive process of mind created the notion there is a world out there, the objective experience. And then the affective process of mind began to feel whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And then we begin to personalize this feeling and say, this is my reaction. You know, we react to it and say, this is my reaction. So upadana paccaya bhava. Upadana means personalizing. So when we personalize the subjective experience, we create the notion of existence. Because when we personalize the experience, we begin to think that it is this body that is experiencing it, therefore this body exists. And therefore, bhava paccaya jati. Bhava, the notion of existence, gives rise to birth. So in other words, every time when we continue to personalize the experience and we begin to think of existence, we will be reborn. That means when the body dies, we will be born again and again and again until we are able to free our mind from the concept of existence, the notion of existence, and awaken from the dream of existence. And that awakening, the state of mind of a person who has awakened from the dream of existence is Nirodha Samapatti. That's what I explained in the beginning of today's sharing. Nirodha Samapatti is the mind of a person who has completely freed for himself from the notion, the concept of existence. So that is a mind that is awoken from existence. And such a person, when the body ends, that person will not be born again, because there is no bhava. And when there is no bhava, then that person will not have jati again, will not be born again. And therefore, we have to be very careful of this. Just go back. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, so it is this here. Right? So we have to be well aware that when we begin to react to the objective experience, that reaction is our subjective experience. And when we begin to personalize the subjective experience, personalizing the Panchakanda, the 5 constituents of the process of perception, then we are creating the notion of existence, coming into existence, the imaginary self in an imaginary world. And that is Sakkaya Ditthi. And with that, when the body ends, we will be born again. Right? As long as we continue to react, that is Tanha, and with that reaction, we personalize the reaction, Upadana, and then we begin to create the notion of existence, because we will automatically think that the body is me. It's the body that is feeling it, Bhava. And because of that, we will be born again and again and again. Jati will keep happening until we can free ourselves from that. So here is the hint that whatever we experience in the world, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, the Vedana at the bottom of this affective process, the Vedana, whatever we feel, don't react to it. When we begin to react to it, that is Tanha. And with that emotional reaction, then we begin to personalize that. Right? So this is really how all this leads to the whole mess of suffering. Okay. So basically, with this, we have completed explaining the Paṭiccasamuppāda. What I will do next week, I will start talking about the insecurity of life, dukkha. Right? So from Paṭiccasamuppāda, we now move on to talk about how we experience the whole mess of suffering. So starting next week, we will have a new topic in the Awakening series. So today, Awakening series number 9. So next week, number 10, we will start talking about the insecurity of life. So remember to download, right, those files, Awakening 9, Paṭiccasamuppāda chart, and of course the book. Okay. So let's end today's sharing by spending this time together. We have accumulated good merits, and we know that around the world there are still a lot of people suffering from the coronavirus pandemic. We are the fortunate people who are able to be sitting here and sharing the Dharma. So let us put our palms together and share our merits with all the people who are suffering from coronavirus. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing the Buddha Dharma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, may we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much for joining us. I wish you a peaceful evening, or in the case of some of you, like Sister Nora, a very good morning, and have a happy day. So may you be healthy, may you stay safe, may you be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.